I'd like to move that this House supports the agricultural industry and encourages innovations that lead to greater microbial activity in the soil, higher concentrations of carbon in the soil, and higher water holding capacity of the soil, alongside reduced dependency on chemical inputs, increased collaboration among farmers, and improved service for regional communities, and in order to create more resilient agricultural landscapes, grow more nutrient-dense food, stimulate rural residential growth, and reduce input costs, thereby providing a greater net return to the farmer.
Members, the Honourable Diane Evers has moved the motion standing in her name. The question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Diane Evers.
Thank you. Now, as we recognised yesterday being National Agriculture Day, it was very important to raise this as an issue because around the country the whole image of agriculture is affected by many issues that happen. And it's not to, without showing that there is more to it than just what's in the news. And that's what we need to recognise. So in farming, in agriculture, we have quite a few different problems that are currently happening that are making it more and more difficult for farmers to make a living. One of those, of course, is the diminishing and inconsistent farm profits. It makes it very hard for the farmers that are there and makes it very difficult for other people to take on this as a potential career choice. We also have low soil fertility, requiring more inputs to achieve continuing production. I hear from different farmers that their cost of inputs, of synthetic inputs into their farm, into their soil, is increasing every year. And there doesn't seem to be any let up to that. And it's having a big impact on their profitability. They hear from their soil agronomist, comes there, does some samples, gives them a long list of nutrients and fertilizers that they need to add. And they have to weigh up the cost of that extra cost and what that's going to do, even if they do have a good harvest year. We also have the lower rainfall. Overall, our rainfall is dropping. We know this is happening. We've been talking about climate change. It's happening. We've got droughts, and we have hailstorms. We have windstorms. Just so much is happening with our climate that is making it harder and harder for these farmers to be able to expect to have a good return at the end of the year. The climate change effects are growing from year to year, and we seem still to be stuck in this mire of politics that keeps us from actually addressing the issue. So farmers they're the ones who are now calling on, we need some action on climate change. We need to recognize that these extreme heat waves and extreme cold bringing frost and other things is just having a devastating effect and making it more and more difficult to be profitable. Salinity, all you need to do is fly over east and look down at the countryside, our landscape. And those natural waterways that would have been here pre-Europeans that connected up one lake system to another in a series in high rainfall, now those lakes are nearly dry, and what is left is very saline. And this isn't something that we should just be moving away from and saying, oh, well, we've ruined that landscape, we'll move on and clear some more and find more agriculture area. We've got to find ways to turn that saline landscape back into productive agriculture land. Same with the acid sulfate soils. It's spreading, and we're not doing what we need to do. We're not doing enough to address the situation so that we can use that landscape for agriculture. And overall, there's just a general lack of resilience in our landscape. We've been reaping the benefits and mining the soil to create our crops, and there's very little left there. And so we just keep going back trying to say, well, we'll just add something else, and what some people refer to as the moron facility, or the moron practice of just putting more and more chemicals back into the soil. It just hasn't been working. Now, because of this, and because of what we've been doing, we've also got fewer permanent jobs in large-scale industrial agriculture. All of our technology wins are to cut out that cost of having employees, and you have fewer and fewer employees and larger equipment. And when you do that, not only does the farmer find themselves indebted to the banks for the money that it costs for that machinery, but there's one less family in the community, one less family to keep the school going and the other facilities. So we've got fewer people living regionally, And then in addition to this, competitors, we're part of the world market, and the markets are very competitive. So if markets come out saying they don't want genetically modified food or crops, or they don't want glyphosate on their food, and they want to find out that it's, make sure they can buy it without that, or they're saying they want organic, we have to, our markets tell us, they're dictating to us what they want. And that's how the market works. So we've got to be able to address that and be able to provide for them the things that they want to have. So now I want to recognize that genetic engineering, it may have a role to play in this. There's new technology coming out with gene editing and CRISPR technology. I've heard from a number of farmers that say that that's what they do for weed control. I don't really want to go to that discussion in this argument. Others may bring it up, because it is a path, and who knows, we may have some success there. As everyone should know, the Greens do support genetically modified techniques for medical purposes. Now, if somehow, using the precautionary principle, we can ensure that it's not going to damage the landscape, it may have a role to play. So it's not the total solution. Agrochemical companies also have a role to play. Now, they're the ones most likely to lose if we stop putting these chemicals into the soil. But they still have the distribution networks. They have the system set up to deal or to work with farmers. And so they should be a part of the solution in some way. Live animal export, another one, may be a part of the story until alternatives can be actioned, because as you'll see as I progress through this discussion, animals are a part of the healing of the landscape. Now, the current situation, it's foisted on us a lot of issues, a lot of problems. Our current practices, which have really evolved in, say, the last 40, 50 years for this really broad-scale monoculture type, very industrial-style farming, have, as I said, reaped the produce from the soil and have left it in a degraded state. And that's what we need to do. We've been focusing on production of quantity. We haven't been looking at quality for some time. All we want is the volume, because that's how we're going to get the best price, or not the best price, but the best number of dollars in the market. So that focus on production quantity has been an impact that has been holding us back from actually doing some really good things with the soil. Financial imperatives of the large size, get big or get out has been the mantra. The banks have been pushing on people, just buy out your neighbor's farm when they choose to sell, and get bigger machinery, grow more of the monoculture you've got. It's another thing that holds us back from actually advancing and growing the best that we can with the resources we've got. So there's also the pressure from those agrochemical companies to add excessive quantities of synthetic fertilizers, synthetic inputs. And the problem with that is that, I was talking to somebody who said, I can't remember which thing he had to add, but although of the 100% of it that he put on the soil, only 5% is taken up by the plants. So if you find your plants need more, you don't find a way to access that other 95%, you just put more on. And it just didn't make sense to the farmer or to me. There's a pressure to, whenever you have a problem, resort to the fungicides, the herbicides, the pesticides. Now, all of these things just kill the life in the soil. So if you can find another way to deal with that problem where you don't just have to kill everything living in the soil, maybe you'll have less problem with those pests. And the pressure to plant monocultures. Now, we all know when you plant monoculture, sure, it's easier, it gives you higher production and all that, but it also presents other problems, other weaknesses, because of course when you have a monoculture, you have nothing to try to counteract when those pests come in. So it's just something, again, to be questioned. And just to mention the agrochemical industry again. Now, they are an industry, they have plenty of shareholders, their role is to continue making profits for their shareholders, and I can't deny that. I think we just need to work with the agrochemical industry to see where they fit into maybe a new style, where we actually start adopting processes that enhance the soil and grow more nutritious food. But the impacts of this current situation now, we know, as I've said, it's harder to earn a living, we've got declining profits. I saw a graph of the Canadian farmers over the last 20, 30 years or so, and it showed that their revenue is going up considerably. But at the same time, their net return is dropping because that input amount is just growing more substantially, more, higher and faster than they can keep up with. And also, we've got the difficulty to enter the market, the size and scale of the agricultural industry. To get in there, I haven't checked the prices or anything, but I would say you're looking at a couple of $1 million to actually get a large-size farm. And that makes it very hard for people who have this idea of, well, maybe it would be good to live regionally, but how can I do it? How can I afford to raise my family and keep food on the table and all that? We've got to make it easier for people to enter the market. And possibly with these large farms that have been amalgamated on many titles over the years, maybe we should start looking at trying to divide up those titles again so that people could get in with a smaller size farm if we find a way through the research to help them make a profit from a smaller farm. So we're getting people leaving the region, we're getting the climate deteriorating, as I've said before. We're not doing anything to address that, and yet one of the solutions is getting carbon into the soil, just like it used to be. And we can do that. That technology is there. It's not even, it's nature is what's going to do it for us. We've also got lower food nutrition. People are starting to realize that although they may be eating larger and larger quantities of food and gaining the weight that goes along with that, they're still not getting the nutrition that they need from their food. And hence around the world, people are trying to go to organic food because they're actually trying to find something that's grown in a more healthy environment. And that market is growing, not so much in Australia, but around the world, it is growing. And then we've got market competition. When I hear about the advances being made in Russia to compete in the wheat market on a scale not seen before with their new transport opportunities through the Ukraine. And they're growing wheat the same quality as ours, and they're doing it cheaper, and they're going to be taking our markets quick. So if we don't get onto this and actually figure out how we're going to deal with that and to match that, we're going to be losing out. And then what happens? That's what I don't want to see. So what I see is, what I've been talking about over the past year or so, there are things happening. There are people doing things differently. There are people improving their soil. And a lot of this is coming through, I've been calling it regenerative agriculture. Over east, they refer to natural sequence farming. It's about looking after the water, making sure you keep the water in your soil, making sure you keep it covered to keep that water there, and make sure you don't kill off everything in your soil, because the microbes will come back. You can put them in, or you can, just make the situation right for the microbes, the mycorrhizal fungi, all the different things. So what we need to do with this is support the farmers who are embarking on this change to regenerative agriculture. We need to support them with research that helps do this. And I understand that the Ag Department is looking into this, and I really appreciate that. But we need more. We've got to look for more encouragements. And I don't have the answers, but it's something that we need to be looking at there. Because if we can get more farmers adopting methods that keep the soil covered through summer, we've even got species now, a legume that's been tested for some time that can be a summer crop. And that keeps that soil covered, so we're not just evaporating the water out of the soil through the summer, only to come onto it at the end of the summer, spray it with herbicides so that you can kill off everything and then plant into a dead soil. We need multi-species or multi-variety cropping, which I've spoken about before, because the diversity above the soil leads to diversity below the soil. And if you have diversity below the soil, those microbes can break down the minerals in the soil. They can get the nutrients out and put them into a form that they can be taken out by the roots of the plants. We need to get animals into the process again. If you look back 100 years ago, the animals and crops were side by side for a large part because the animals provide the nutrients of the fertilizer that they'd leave behind. And if you do it on a rotational basis, then you give those plants enough time to regenerate. That was the idea of fallow, leaving a crop fallow. It wasn't just to leave it bare and empty so that it dehydrated and died. It was to leave it fallow, to leave it time to regenerate, to use those nutrients and build up the soil again and build up the microbes so that they could help the plants grow and thrive. The mineral fertilizers, I'm hearing a lot more about that because the mineral fertilizers are what the microbes can use to make the nutrients available. Rather than just putting on the synthetic fertilizers where you just put in the one that you need and you hope the plant gets it, even though there's nothing there to support that action happening. And the reduced chemical inputs. As I said, each time we put the pesticide on there, we're not just killing the one grub or beetle that we're after, we're killing a lot of other things too. And some of those things are actually beneficial to the plants growing. So what we need to look at, some of the things that are out there I'm hearing are more cooperative arrangements where farmers are starting to work together. And I can see a cooperative working well in communities, because then when you've got people that can share knowledge, share equipment, share resources, they can both grow from that. But sometimes that's going to take some help, some assistance to make sure that it can work. And I think we can have a role in that. Also, providing services in the region. If we want people to go out there, some of the people I've known that have gone to farming, they didn't come from a farming background, but they moved to the region with a job in, maybe in government service or something, teaching, whatever, local government. And over the time they were there, they thought, what I really want to do is be back on the land. So while they were working, they bought their land, they planted their crop, whatever it was, and they developed that business until the point where they could actually leave the employed situation and just run full-time on the farm. And if we can make opportunities for that to happen, that's going to benefit those communities, because that's how we can get young people out of the city, the metro area, and into the regions so that they can raise their family there and have a good income and be contributing to the community. Because we do need people living in the regions. It will benefit us overall. So we need to help too by putting those services in the region so that people have the things they need there. We can't expect them to have to travel 2 or 3 hours to get to a doctor or something like that. There's got to be a reasonable level of service, education, the schools. It's something that we have that ability to encourage, to make it possible. As I said, another time I talked about the regional incentives. I don't know exactly what this is. In the past, we gave land away. I can't see that happening again. But what we've got to do is make it possible for people to buy in. Maybe there is some sort of a program where we can have either low-interest loans or something that makes it possible for people to buy into this, where they can create a business, create a lifestyle, a family, and build those communities again. And from all this, what I'm hoping to see is that if we can regenerate the landscape and regenerate those communities, our farmers are going to win because, one, their status is going to go up, and they deserve that. We need to appreciate and admire our farmers because they produce food, and none of us are going to be able to stay alive without it. So, if we can help farmers and encourage more people to take that up, we're going to be much better off. I mean, if we start growing so much more, we've just got more exports, which again is good because we need something to balance those highs and lows of the mining industry. Food will always be a necessity. And if we can help our farmers, they're going to be able to do that for us. And then we'll be able to help our regional communities because our regional communities support the farmers. The farmers don't want to live out there all on their own with no one else to communicate with, to be a part of a social situation. We need good, strong regional communities because that provides that balance, that work-life balance that we've all been told to go after. And the farmers, yes, they work, but they deserve to have that balance too. And we need to make sure that they've got a community where they can have a local footy team, or they can, be involved in one way or another in the things that are important to them. I mean, how many footy teams have lost their members over the years so that they just can't even operate anymore because they just don't have enough people? That's the lifeblood of being out there. That's what the regional communities can offer, is that connection, that social connection. And then the last one to benefit from this whole system are going to be us, our families, our communities, all those people out there who eat food. Because the food that comes from this has got the nutrition in it that we need. It won't have the pesticide and herbicide residues on it that we're finding more and more research is saying, yes, that's in your food, get used to it. It's in breast milk, it's in the placenta of babies, women, whatever. You know, those chemical residues are all around us, and you know, you have to just look at all the ill health that's happening as well. And if we can grow more nutritious food, you know, we're all going to benefit. And I really look forward to a time where we actually appreciate the value of our food and the value of the farmers and the value of our regional communities, because we can make a difference. We can change how this is done, and that's what I'm looking forward to.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Steve Thomas.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank the member for her motion and the opportunity to have some discussion today about agriculture and regional areas. And I've learnt this week, Madam President, that as the Honourable Diane Evers has said, this week one day was National Agriculture Day, and the Honourable Charles Smith told us earlier in the week that one day this week was apparently International Men's Day. So I'm assuming that if you're a man in agriculture this week, somebody should be buying you a beer. And I hope that's the case, because I think that the recognition of that input should be well noted across the chamber. Madam President, this is an interesting motion, and my biggest problem with it is that there's so much in it. In the short time available, there's no way we're going to be able to address all of those things that have been raised, and beyond that, the things that the Honourable Diane Evers has raised during her address. So I'm hoping to concentrate on a couple of key areas, and maybe other members, when they jump up to do a contribution, can focus on some of the other areas. But let me start by talking a little bit about the construct of soil, which I think is the first dot point in the member's motion: microbial activity, soil carbon, water holding capacity, and I'm going to throw in micronutrients in that one as well. Now, it is absolutely the truth that Australian soils generally, and Western Australian soils in particular, are notable around the world for their low soil carbon levels. And unfortunately for us in Western Australia, our average soil quality is not considered high. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So in terms of soil carbon, for example, and soil carbon is critical because that's the basic building block of all life. We are carbon-based life forms. The plants that grow up are carbon-based life forms. They grow and feed the animals, which are carbon-based life forms. We all form around effectively a benzene ring of carbon. All of life on Earth effectively comes from that basis, so it is the most critical element. Soils in Australia vary from less than 1% carbon to somewhere in the very high fertile areas, somewhere between 10 to 14%. And I take the 14% figure with a little bit of a grain of salt myself. Not that we like to talk about salt in soils, but the reality is that that 14% I think is a very high figure. Probably 10 to 12% for high soil carbons is a reasonable number. Now, it gets as low as 0.3 to 0.5%, particularly in desert and sandy soils. And it may have come to the attention of members of the council that Western Australia is well blessed with very sandy soils, particularly on the Swan Coastal Plain and as you go further inland. So there is a lot of Western Australian soil that, in terms of soil carbon, sits in that around 1 to 2% category. Some of our better soil sitting at 4 and 5%, and we have very little soil that sits up in double figures, very little soil. And that's because in the eastern states you have areas like the Darling Downs, for example, where you have, and I'll use in the old scale, so 120 feet, so 30 to 40 metres of 10% soil carbon, black and brown soils with which you're planting your crops. In Western Australia, we tend to be looking at much shallower soils, at much sandier soils, and soil carbon levels at sort of 1 to occasionally 3%. Now, that is an issue for production, and that is an issue that we have to deal with. There have been various attempts to try and increase soil quality by increasing soil carbon. It's a bit difficult to do, and I'm not going to have time to go into the breakdown between organic and inorganic soil carbons, but the reality is, if you measure that soil carbon, just take the top 30 centimetres or so, the top foot of soil across Australia. That soil carbon that sits in there represents 25 billion tonnes of carbon that sits in the soil across Australia. Now, if you look at that and take such a low average, if you could increase that soil carbon by 1% on average across Australia, which in theory wouldn't be that hard because the average is so low. You can pick up 1% would give you 250 million tonnes of carbon going into soils, which would do some amazing things. Now, you'd get some leakage back out of that, which is a bit critical. You have to remember that not all the soil carbon that you put in place stays there, and you don't want it to stay there. Because if you're turning it into production, you want to turn it into from soil carbon to plant carbon to animal carbon. So actually you don't hold it all in there, but you can build a cycle by increasing soil carbon significantly that actually ties up carbon as well as increases production. The issue, and the member raised this, obviously is one of cost, because it's not easy to do. I've seen over the years people attempt to do this in a range of ways. For some period of time back in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, there were attempts made to take coal, crush it up from collie and put it on soil. And that inorganic carbon, which interestingly is coal, started life as organic carbon many, many years ago, became inorganic carbon, and an attempt to make it organic carbon again, that transfer is not easy. It's not easy, it's not necessarily cheap. So it's a difficult process, it's a worthy aim, something that we should do a lot more work on. Now, what we should also do a lot more work on, obviously, is soil microbes, and that's raised in that first point as well. When the issue we have in terms of microbial activity is the complete lack of knowledge we have of the microbes that are there, the work that they do and how they interact. I mean, honourable members, we don't really know what microbes, what bacteria, what good bacteria in particular sit on your skin. So we have some idea of some of the bacteria that sits on your skin. We don't know most of it, and we don't know how it interacts. And that's for something that we value very highly, which is our own personal health. So the amount of research that we've been able to put into soil microbes is microbial in itself. So there's lots of stuff we don't know. It is important, it is critical for soil nutrition. It builds off soil carbon, but we don't know enough about that to be able to have a major impact yet. It's hopefully something that over time, and when I say time, we're probably talking millennia in the end, that we need to get to over time. It's a critical issue. The same applies with water retention, and I'm aware of some of the things the members mentioned, the slow water momentum that's being developed around Australia, that is slowing the water flow across the landscape, and in particular on property. So you're holding water into that landscape and into that soil for longer is some good stuff. There's some very good work that's been done on that, and I'm a bit of a fan of that process. There's some great examples of that. Some people in Western Australia are trying to pull that on. There's actually some good scientific experiments, and I think a Nuffield scholar actually did some around the Pilbara for those members of the mining and pastoral region, based specifically on slowing that water process through. So when you combine increased soil carbon, a slowing of the water, and an improvement in our knowledge of microbial activity, you will actually have an improvement in agriculture over time, and all of those things require work. Obviously, they all require investment. All of those things are important. I don't necessarily have the same level of belief that you can't do some of those things with synthetic fertilisers and synthetic activity. So some of that synthetic activity is very important. And I'll give you, as an example, the area around Esperance. Now, the area around Esperance, which was largely non-productive for many, many years, became productive because of some investment in technology, particularly brought about by some Americans who came into Esperance half a century ago, and put some investment into synthetic fertilisers that made a significant difference to production there, particularly with micronutrient lacks. And then micronutrients is the fourth part of that equation. So when you've got carbon, you've got water, you've got microbes, and you've got micronutrients. I mean, even when you think it's not an issue, it's an issue. The amount of calcium, for example, you pull out simply in a beef production exercise. If you're breeding a cow to 4 acres and you take a calf off that every year, and that calf's 500 kilos, if you're lucky, and a certain percentage of that is calcium, you're stripping 20 to 30 kilos of calcium out of your land every year in production that you don't necessarily put back. So those are the 4 holy grail components of soil nutrition. But the whole thing is overseen, and I wish we had 2 hours each to speak about this, honourable member, because I could do a very long speech on this one.
So do I. It's very interesting.
It's a very important topic that we cannot do credit with in this particular debate. But as is quite famous, it all comes back to the economics. It's the economy, stupid, I believe is the expression. That's not reflected in any member here, including the mover. It all comes back to economics. Now, across Australia, most returns in agriculture, most farmers sit at 2-3% return on capital. Some of the best ones get up to double figures, but that's rare, it's occasional, and I could go through the list of those that have done well. I know my good friend, the Honourable Ken Travers' people up in the north often do better than 3 or 4%, but around the southwest, in particular in my area and your area, 2 to 3% return on investment is as good as it gets, and until that becomes better, a lot of the money required to do all that research is not going to eventuate, and that has to happen to make it work.
The Honourable Conor de Grussa, the question is the motion be agreed.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to obviously add a contribution on this motion, and I want to thank the Honourable Diane Evers for bringing this motion to us today. I can also thank the Honourable Dr quote-unquote Benzene Ring for his contribution this morning on his Soil Science 101, which was very interesting, I'm sure, for everyone. But I want to take a different tack and talk about some of the things that we are doing in agriculture, or have been doing for a number of years, and then also a little bit about how farmers learn, because I think that's an integral part of practice change, which is a little bit about what we're talking about today. So we heard previously about the Esperance area, obviously an area dear to my heart, as it's where I farmed for many, many years. And it was back in the 1970s that I remember as a young kid watching the dust storms day after day after day during that seeding period, the cultivation and that fragile soil and the resultant dust storm that evolved to the point where you couldn't see more than a metre or two in front of you. It was awful, but we moved on very quickly from there, because obviously that is not the way to have a sustainable farming system. And so the advent of systems such as no tillage, which reduced obviously cultivation of the soil and as a consequence increased organic carbon and organic matter in the soils. Our own soil tests over the years did show increases in organic carbon, and very small, because as the Honourable Dr Steve Thomas pointed out, a big change in soil carbon is, a small change in soil carbon is a very big change in a lot of things, including water holding capacity, nutrient retention and productivity. So there is, I guess, a notion that we use more and more inputs to directly increase our outputs, but our practice change has also resulted in an increase in productivity because of the lack of loss of nutrients, the lack of loss of moisture, and an increase in soil biota as well. So we've got more active soil biology, we've got more bugs in the soil, more of the soil mycorrhiza and fungi as well, which increase the productivity of the soil. So all these things are happening, or have been happening for a while. They happen because farmers are always looking for ways to improve what they do and make the job they do a sustainable one, because ultimately it's in their interests as custodians of the land and in their business interests as well. And yes, farming agriculture is a business, but I don't know any farmer who is not also passionate about the land on which they farm. So some of the things that have happened in those years include the adoption of no-till, as I said, summer cropping, moving to, in areas where it's suitable. It's not suitable as a broad brush approach everywhere, but we certainly adopted that to the point where it's used quite widely in many areas in this state as a means of improving the soil, of giving something living on the soil over that dry summer period, which then obviously provides feed for stock, but ultimately contributes to improving the soil's health. There is a lot of research to be done on this, because there is a lot of anecdotal evidence about what those crops actually do for the subsequent crops, despite logic and some science saying that they should be detrimental. The opposite is true. There's plenty of research to be done on that, and I think it's a very interesting field. So in terms of summer cropping, so the effect that that has on the subsequent crop, there is a lot of work to be done, I believe, on following up on that, because the The conventional wisdom is that drying out your soil will have a detrimental effect on the following crop. The actual anecdotal evidence from my experience and others is that it actually improves the following crop for reasons that still to be largely determined. Back in the early days, in the late 80s and 90s, my father was involved heavily with WANTFA, and he was instrumental in bringing out a lady named Jill Clapperton from Canada. She is a soil biologist and had some fascinating insights into improvements in soil productivity and farming systems through improvements in soil biology. And this could all be done within the realms of the farming system as it was. It didn't require massive changes. It required an understanding of how that soil biology worked. And so farmers have always been interested in that sort of thing, and interested in understanding how their soil works, because ultimately it's more productivity for them. In order to do all that, of course, farmers have to have a mechanism by which to learn and to understand these new practices. And that has largely been done through the rapid rise over probably the late 80s and through the 90s of the grower group. A wonderful tool for farmers to come together and learn about new practices and what it will mean to them on their own farms. And in fact, a report commissioned by the Grower Group Alliance here in WA summarise some of the key points here are that there are about 45 grower groups in Western Australia with an average of 124 members. They are ranked in the top 3, in fact they're number 2, for influencing practice change of farmers. So the grower group is integral in the adoption of new practices and techniques in agriculture. They have about $12 million invested into research and development by grower groups, and about $2 million of in-kind contributions from farmers and volunteers involved with those groups. So it's a very significant contribution of time and effort by people in the industry for the return that they get. One of my great friends and a colleague, a Nuffield scholar and farmer from just up the road down in Esperance, Chris Reichstein, wrote a report from his 2014 Nuffield Scholarship called How Farmers Learn, where he took a lot of time to actually examine the different mechanisms by which farmers learn, because one of his big frustrations was that there was a lot of great new practices out there that could be adopted, but they weren't necessarily being adopted. So he wanted to find out what it was that led to better uptake of these new practices, and he spent a lot of time studying this. And a couple of the things he says in his report here are, if I can just find it here, that research, so we talk about the Grower Group Alliance again, and research that they undertook actually demonstrated that every dollar spent by grower groups in Western Australia generated a direct economic benefit for the economy of $10, so a 10-to-1 cost to benefit ratio. That's pretty extraordinary, and equates to about $120 million a year. So over a 25-year period, that's a cumulative economic benefit of $2.3 to $3.6 billion for the Western Australian economy, which is absolutely huge. A very significant way to improve our economic circumstances as well as to drive change in agriculture. One of the other things he talked about in here is that research is driven by farmers when we use the grower groups. It's driven from the farmer end, and ultimately they get a strong sense of ownership over that research, and that in turn leads to better uptake of those new practices. Growers draw on many sources of information in the decision-making process. However, grower groups have far greater influence on decision-making due to their localised or topic-specific focus. Grower groups are viewed as credible and trusted sources of information, which is used for long and short-term decision-making. In many cases, farmers gain ideas and information at a grower group level, then use consultants and advisors to actually go out and ground truth those ideas. There is far more in this report than I have time to discuss. Again, such an interesting topic. Agriculture, obviously something that I do like to talk about, and many others in this place do as well. I won't go on to talk any more about this report, but I'd recommend highly that if anyone wants to have a read and learn a little bit about how farmers learn and some of the wonderful different techniques that other countries use in terms of collaboration and peer collaboration, where farmers come together and literally open their books completely to a group of farmers in their area who they would traditionally see in some competitive kind of light, and the changes that's led to in terms of business and other practices is quite incredible. All of this requires strong grower groups, and it also requires agriculture to be on the education menu very strongly so that we can get the scientists and the young people with the fresh ideas coming through the system. So that requires education to be a core focus, or agriculture to be a core focus of education, which in my view requires us to adopt something similar to that which New South Wales has done, ensuring that agriculture is actually part of the curriculum and taught in every school, not just at agricultural colleges, because there are plenty of ideas from kids who have never been exposed to agriculture, and often those ideas are some of the best and will lead to much better outcomes.
Look, I thank the honourable member for bringing up this in non-government business and the other contributions from the other members. My contribution today is mainly going to be focused at someone in this place that can actually do something about this, and so that's the minister. And so that's where most of my focus will be on. I look at the major things, and when I speak, I don't come with a farming background or any expertise in soil, but I do consult with the farmers, many farmers, and these are the things that they are saying. So I'd like to just speak on their behalf on certain things. I suppose the areas that I want to cover today are farmers want change. They really do. It will probably be worth about $1.5 billion to this state in lost production if we don't fix these problems. More action from the government is needed. The talk has been good. The focus and the language coming from the minister has been good, but we'll talk about more action as I go through. Science does have some of the answers to our problems. We do need to fix the salinity problems first before we get into the biology of the soil, and I have some discussion on that. The NRMs need to be better funded into the future, and I will be asking what's the state's contribution in that. Lime is a part of the solution, only one part. The minister has an expert in lime in the Ag Department, Dr. Gazy, and the language that I hear coming from him and other experts in that area are saying to fix the salinity problems first, and then we can fix the biology in the soil. And also, there is a problem with farmers. They have, in their eyes, they aren't happy with the Ag Department, and there's a loss of credibility there. And it's not my intention here today to have a go at the Ag Department, but they have an issue with the farmers. The old methodology that's been promoted for many years has now been proven to be wrong. Whilst the Honourable Steve Thomas mentioned that synthetic fertilisers could be of some use, there is obviously the old prescription farming based on that hasn't worked that well when it comes to the quality of the soil. But it has helped our farmers be productive over many years. And the farmers of Western Australia in particular have been very inventive in getting as much as they can out of the poor soils of Western Australia. Now, they have done a good job, and they've got a big job in front of them. Now, I also was in front of front row seat in front of Mr. Charles Massey when he made his remarks at the WA Farmers Conference back in March. And I really did enjoy what he had to say. But it's not as easy as that. As this saying's been mentioned before, it's very hard to be green when you're in the red. So there's a lot of work to be done. And, you know, whilst I thought his insights were fantastic, There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I have a very friendly warning to the minister that at the moment she has been talking the right language. She is on the right track with her language. But she's starting to lose support from the farmers because it's been 2 years and they haven't seen enough action at this stage. So action in changing in many aspects of the soil quality and the methods that need to go through. Now, I also want to mention the fact that if we look at changing the methods, this is a change of culture. And we can use words like regenerative agricultural farming and all of those words, but in the end, the minister is in charge of changing that culture. That's a big job and a very hard job. It's a value, it's an attitude, it's a culture that we need to change, and that's going to take time. As I mentioned right at the start, farmers want this change, but they are finding it very difficult. And just recently there was a soil... Yep.
Get very upset.
Well, farmers that I talk to want to change, and I'm not a part of the National Party, and I'm speaking on behalf of the One Nation Party. Look, farmers. I wasn't at the Brookton Soil Conservation Day in Brookton, but I had people there that have reported back to me on certain things, and a lot of farmers didn't turn up to that. That should have been there, because it was the same old experts from the Ag Department now telling them something completely different to what they'd been telling them for many years before. So they had an issue with that. There's a loss of credibility there. And that's something the minister has to deal with. That's not an easy...
So you want me to do something different, but I can't do it.
Hold on, I'll keep going.
I'm trying to work it out.
So I would say that
I can't get our people.
at the moment there is a lot of talk and just not enough action, and I'll talk about some of the things that the action could bring. Now, let's get on to one issue. I have mentioned this before in this House. Lime. Dr Gazy, the Ag Department's lime expert, science says that the industry needs about 2.5 million tonnes of lime every year just to stop the soil acidity issue worsening. At the moment, we're using about half of that. And the reason why is it's too expensive. The reason why is it's too expensive, there's lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons is the transport route is near on impossible, and the costs are very prohibitive for the farmers. So they want to use more of that, and they want help from the government to help with that transport route and to make lime readily available and cheaper. I also want to mention the fact that Natural Resource Management Group, there's 7 of them in Western Australia, and there's been a lot of great work done for many years over the last decade. Now, the minister has used Nick and Lucy Kelly as people who are now having a success story with soil health. And the minister may not know this, but they kicked off their journey on this with the NRMs. The NRMs were funded by the federal government, and they have been helping these farmers for many years in attacking this soil health issue. And I'd like to see the state government make a contribution to the NRMs because their federal funding has been cut. And this is an issue because they have done some great work over the last 10 years or so. So that collaboration from the minister between the NRMs, the federal government's funding, and also the state government.
Can I just say that we actually give the NRM funding every year. That is funding that we give. That's state government funding.
I'm under the belief that that funding is mainly coming from the federal government.
Their land care grants.
And a lot of their funding has now been cut.
Ask me a question.
And that is a problem.
And I can tell you.
So, I would be interested to hear what the state's contribution is when the minister has a discussion on this later on. Science says that farmer-to-farmer, peer-to-peer learning results is the greatest adoption. So that's when people, as the Honourable Colin de Grussa just mentioned, when farmers talk with each other, look right across the globe, look across the country and discuss different methods and open up the books, as he said, that is when the best results come about, working together with science. Now, look, to wrap up on this, I suppose the most important thing for me is that the minister, I believe, is on the right course. She has put together a group to discuss soil health, and I commend her for that, as I commend the honourable member for bringing this discussion up.
The question is the motion be agreed. I call the Minister for Regional Development. I assume with the government response.
With the government response, thank you very much. And look, can I thank the Honourable Diane Evers for giving everyone here an opportunity to talk about an issue that we know right across this parliament is of critical interest. So we really appreciate you doing that. And look, I think we've had really interesting contributions from everyone, and I have to say I love the lesson on soil carbon. I'll put you on my soil carbon round table if you don't. Look, there are so many issues here to try to deal with all of these in 15 minutes and give everyone justice. But look, one of the points that the Honourable Diane Evers made was a very good economic point that sometimes we lose, and that is that when you make yield your ultimate goal, that you often are not talking about profitability. And there is a sense in which what one hears from many farmers that the cost of inputs as they seek to manage the declining fertility of the land, that you are having this cycle of input costs that are so high that this is undermining the profitability of many farming ventures. And we absolutely, I think, right across this chamber and right across the political spectrum, we recognise that farming is a uniquely risky business. Every year people put themselves on the line looking at taking their chances with the weather, not having a complete understanding of what the weather is going to deal with them and what is going to happen in terms of biosecurity problems that emerge. So we all recognise that that farmers need the support to make their this challenging enterprise, this incredibly important enterprise, very sound. So I think we've got to have these open and frank discussions. And I was heartened by the comments of the Honourable Colin Ticknell that everyone is enthusiastic about us talking of this language and looking at the benefits of regenerative farming, which has a much greater emphasis on the development of soil biology and soil carbon than seeing the soil as an NPK box that holds the plants upright and you pour the inorganic chemicals into it. I'm heartened that you say that. I'm not quite sure that we have actually got there, but I do take the point that Honourable Colin de Grussa made, is that farmers are eager to learn, that farmers want to do the right thing, they want to have a sustainable practice, and they are keen to learn. I do say, and I think Honourable Colin de Grussa, you would recognise that sometimes that there is a little bit of resistance to change, and you have farmers that start the process, and there's a bit of pullback, and people are critical of it. but then eventually over time. Now, I think we're going through that process, and you've spoken about no-till, and I understand that no-till absolutely widely practised today, but there was a bun fight at the time. You know, it wasn't something that everyone said, oh, gee whiz, that's a good idea. And, you know, farmers that were trying it were, you know, called hippies and mung beans and whatever for the first couple of years. So we understand that that is just the way it goes. A very interesting Andrew, Tim Overhoy, who's one of our ag people, actually showed a letter at this conference where I think it was his great-grandfather, a German chap, who was the first West Australian farmer to use superphosphate. And the critique at the time was, from all the other farmers, it'll never work, you're dreaming. So we do know that change is sometimes presaged by a resistance, and we understand that, and we respect, as I say, the need for us to work in a very cooperative manner on this regard. Look,
That was selling them the old story, now talking a completely
yeah, well,
different
I mean,
language.
the only thing I could do, I suppose, is go out and, you know, sack them all and get a new mob in. But of course people will have to learn. I mean, and people change. I mean, I change. I've changed my attitude over the years on many things. And it's, I guess, it's not... So when the science tells you that something different to what you thought, you need to move with that. And I would like to think that our agricultural scientists have open minds, and that they may have in the past been presenting one story, but now with just as probably the very same people that once opposed no-till now go out and support it. So people have to learn, and this is what we've got to understand. We've got to be agile and flexible. Now, I really probably don't have time to deal with all of these issues, but I do want to talk about, the Honourable Colin de Grussa talked about grower groups and their importance, and of course they are massively important. But I also think it is important because there's a little bit of an issue there that all of the research money should be going to grower groups. And I know you didn't say that, but there's possibly a subtext there. But can I give you an example of this magnificent new development in agriculture, a new plant that we released just a month or so ago? Tedralanza, which is a legume that will provide summer cropping for areas of around 300 mil rainfall. So it is a crop that will grow all year round. It will grow in conjunction with other perennials or annuals and volunteer plants. It is highly nutritious for sheep, and it promises to be quite a game changer in the area of sheep farming, as does another plant that is being brought on up behind it, which is another legume, or the Tedralanza, was originally from Canary Islands, and coming up behind it is Lebbeckia ambigua, which will be another summer-growing legume that will be suitable for even lower rainfall areas and more marginal soils. Now, these are the product of decades of work. Now, talking to Dr. Real Ferreira, who was the fabulous Department of Ag scientist who developed Tedralanza, he has been working on that for 18 years. You need to have institutions that are capable of having people employed over that length of time. He personally went out and found the Tedera plants in the Canary Islands and collected them and painstakingly bred them over more than a decade to come up to do the trials and come up with the optimum plant for West Australian circumstances. That is why you can't just throw all of your research funding out into the grower groups, because you've got to have that accumulation of knowledge. You've got to have those people that can be employed long term to do that work. Likewise with Professor Howson. I mean, he is at Murdoch University. But, you know, the work that he's doing in Lebekia, we will see next year the benefits of those. So I think it's important to make that point. Now, I want to talk about soil carbon. Immensely important, and it is also something that there is a real opportunity to develop. So we are developing a carbon farming strategy, and some of that, the first bits that we are doing are focusing on the pastoral lands, and we are looking at the human-induced regeneration. That will be, and I think there's 15 pastoral leases that have been successful now with our help of getting federal funding through the Emissions Reduction Fund. But we think that there is even greater benefit and potential from soil carbon. And the Honourable Steve Thomas, you focused on the cost, and quite rightly. But we have actually got a unique opportunity now. We have a unique opportunity because for just this year, for the first time, that a methodology has been approved for judging the accumulation of carbon in the soil. So that you can now, using this methodology, you can get ACUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, which you can tender for sale in the federal government's Emission Reduction Fund, or you can sell on the private market. And there is an increasing number of people that are requiring these carbon offsets under existing legislation. Major companies that are producing more than 100,000 tonnes of carbon emissions a year need to buy these offsets. At the moment, they're buying them from Queensland and New South Wales. We want them to buy them here. So here we've got is a unique opportunity to actually have an external source of funds that will help underpin this issue of soil, rebuilding the carbon in our soil. Now, I have to say, I'm trying to sort of select which are the most important issues. I just need to say to you, Honourable Colin Ticknor, I don't agree with you that you fix the salinity first and then you fix the soil, or that you fix the aluminium toxicity or the acidification of soil, then you fix the other thing. That is not correct. That really the sophisticated view that is now becoming to be understood is that these things are integrally involved, that they are, that there are ways of dealing with all of these things that really involve building up the biota in the soil. So it's not you do this, build these massive drains and take away the salt. There is a much more sophisticated discussion to be had around that, and hopefully with our first salinity roundtable.
Scientists at the Ag Department.
Yeah, I know. I'm not.
Expert view.
Yeah, well, and if you've made your career in liming, of course that's what you want to do. But we have to have our minds open to these other possibilities. Now, we are funders of the. And look, can I just say one further thing? I would say, because the Honourable Steve Thomas is a very well-educated man, and he constantly educates us. And I have to say, very genuinely, I do appreciate that. But can I suggest that you don't necessarily take the current state of Australian soils, or West Australian soils, to be the state that they necessarily were in at the time of settlement? And there's plenty of argument to suggest, and plenty of evidence from the first explorers that suggest that we had in those open plains, we had very, very spongy soils, and they were very spongy because they had massive amounts of carbon that had been built up to a metre depth, and the amount of water that was retained, not running off into the rivers, was much greater. But within a couple of decades of the sheep coming in, that fundamentally changed. So we have got an ancient landscape, we haven't had recent volcanoes, that has a consequence, but also our farming practices have had a consequence on that. But look, we are going to be doing a series of trials in Wongan Hills, and we want to design these with the farming community because we agree with the Honourable Colin de Grussa. We've got to bring farmers into, and you know, we've obviously got those, the grower group, I suppose, that is the regen farmers, you could call a grower group, but we want more people to be involved in designing some long-term trials because this is all about getting the science right. And we think an important contribution that we can make is establishing those long-term trials. Now, in terms of NRM funding, we have absolutely committed over $7 million per year to NRM funding, and we very expressly this year added into the assessment regenerative farming.
The question is the motion be agreed. I call the Honourable Robin Chappell.
Acting Deputy President. I wasn't going to make any comments until the Honourable Steve Thomas made some comments earlier on, and he touched on fertiliser. And as I've been sort of in the mining and petroleum industry for many years, I thought I'd bring some facts to the chamber. Half of the world's protein currently is derived from the Haber-Bosch process of converting natural gas into ammonia and then nitrogen. And as we know, Western Australia has completely depleted and inert soils because they're many billions of years old, having derived originally from what was the McDonnell Ranges and filling in the inland sea, which was the Neoproterozoic basin. Having said that, we have very, very limited supplies of gas in Western Australia, even though we quite often talk about being one of the world's largest suppliers of natural gas. As far as natural gas goes, we only have 1.9% of world supply. Now, according to the BP resources of future projections, the world only has 50 years of natural gas left. And this is a very august body. So we've got approximately 100 years of coal, 50 years of natural gas and about 50 years of petroleum. So I think the key issue for me is where are we going to be once we have used up our resources of natural gas? Now, one of the unfortunate things for Western Australia and Australia more generally is we've got a very depleted soil. We're currently exporting most of our natural gas offshore and will continue to do so on long-term contracts. So from a Western Australian perspective, 50 years' time, where are we going to be getting our fertilisers from? Given that we know that when it comes to the rest of the world, 17.2% is held by Iran, 18.1% by Russia, and Norway and other northern nations have considerable amounts of gas reserve, and they will become very political into the future in terms of how they're used to sustain their populations. So, looking at the BP review and the progress, my concern, I suppose, is how do we manage our soils into the future, not the next political term of 4 years or 10 years, but into the future of our grandchildren in Western Australia and Australia. So just putting some of that into perspective, the OECD has 9.2% of world supply of gas, where the non-OECD countries have 90.8%. This, again, is going to play significantly into the future of how we deal with these issues. Now, we do have some gas to urea projects in Western Australia, and we've got some new ones coming on board. But what I wanted to bring to the House was where we're going to be into the future, calling about sustainability, and what we do with our gas reserves in terms of the fact that we know currently 50% of the protein that is derived for us around the world comes from natural gas. Where are we going to be globally, and where are we going to be as a nation and as a state into the future?
The question is the motion be agreed. I call the Honourable Darren West.
Thank you, Mr Acting President. And look, I'll just rise briefly to acknowledge the motion. Very good motion. Always welcome the opportunity to talk about the greatest industry on earth, and that is agriculture. It's an industry that I've spent a long time in, committed my life to, and certainly I'm of the view that we should talk about this all the time, because it's said, members, that you might need a doctor every few months and a lawyer every few years, but you need a farmer 3 times a day. So I think every day should be World Agriculture Day, and every day, every time we eat something, we should think about how it got to be on our plate and appreciate the work that went into it getting there, and not waste it, and treat our food more respectfully and more importantly, I believe. But that's another discussion. And I note that yesterday there was a day proclaimed as National Agriculture Day or something, and I think that was Barnaby Joyce Day. That's right, yeah. And it became known as Barnaby Joyce Day, and it became a bit of a national embarrassment that Barnaby Joyce was awarded the prize for the best person in agriculture or something, and it was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous, and it made a mockery of our industry. And so, whilst yesterday was acknowledged that day, I think we probably need a new approach to this. And it's great that we can come into the Parliament and talk about agriculture, and I'll welcome that as regularly as we can. Ours is a fantastic industry, and there's never ever been a better time to be involved in it. And I get a little bit tired about people talking us down. We've innovated through some of the least fertile soils in the world, through some of the most unreliable rainfall patterns in the world, and we've built an industry, a $6 billion industry here in Western Australia, with some great people, with some great ideas, who are often averse to change, but will eventually get there. I think that's a fair assessment of our industry. We have small groups of early adopters who bring others with them. The number of farmers is declining significantly because most farms are sold to a neighbouring farmer, and I do take the Honourable Diane Evers' point about this, that it is a changing rural demographic that we now have when it comes to the composition of our rural towns, because change is the only constant in life, and it's certainly the only constant in agriculture, and we have now, because of the economics of farming, move to much larger economies of scale, much more efficient methods. We adopt the change that inevitably leads to less workforce required and less labour required. And I look at things like no-till, where that was probably the big push in the 80s and 90s. Before that, we had the introduction of glyphosate and chemicals that would kill weeds without us having to physically damage and cultivate them to remove them from our paddocks. We went through the advances in machinery in the 70s, big advances in machinery, and enabling us to get big or get out, which was the cry of the time. And I remember many farmers saying, "Well, I've done both. Now what?" But there was certainly a push into greater economies of scale in farming. And so there should be, because other businesses are the same. If you go for a look up in the Pilbara at the mining operations up there, every industry is working to a more efficient and larger economies of scale, and so should farming, and it will continue to do so. And I've got to confess, there are things on our farm that we have adopted. We were very early into that no-till space, very early into that, because I could see that as a much more efficient and easier and better way to plant crops. And grow food. But in terms of GPS technology, we're only just getting into that space now, probably 20 years after others. So I guess we all adopt change, but we adopt it in our own way and at our own pace. and will continue to do so. And look, I'm very excited about, the Honourable Colin Ticknell, perhaps a little bit unsure about why we might have a department that dares to change with the industry, but I'm very excited about some of the new things that we're talking about in soil biology, regenerative agriculture, looking after our soils, because I think that will indeed help us find a more efficient way to make the economics. I'm sorry? Well, I went to that day in Brookton. There was a good group of farmers there, a good lot of farmers there.
Yeah, there's a lot that didn't turn up.
We can't always just drop everything and run off the farm. But I think that day was a success, and I think everyone. I've been to quite a few of these fora now, and there's always a few more farmers each time. I think there is interest in this because industrial farming we are running on some pretty fine margins. The Honourable Dr Steve Thomas is quite right. 2 to 10% is our return on investment. They're quite tight, and it can be a number of years until you recover from a drought because of that. So I think we're all looking at ways that we can perhaps mitigate some of our risk, that we can look at new ways that if the soil can regenerate itself, it certainly saves us. Our input and fertiliser and chemical costs are a significant part of our expenditure. And I think people are open for that discussion. Now, it's not to say that we have to stop doing it the way we've always been doing it. People will make that change for their own reasons and under their own circumstances. And I do take your point. If you're in a fair way and your equity is down to 60, 50%, you probably don't have the capacity to perhaps pick up some of those changes that you might if you had an equity of 70 or 80%, which is where most of us sort of like to be. So we're all have something in common as farmers, but we also have quite different ways of going about food production. And I think that's something that makes our industry dynamic and changeable, because we don't all just line up and do things exactly the same way. I often make the gag that on our place there's a bit over 5,000 acres and there's 5,000 different types of soil, and I think that's about right. We do have very mixed soil types, and that does make managing the soil much more difficult than in places like the Darling Downs, as was mentioned by the Honourable Dr Steve Thomas. So, look, I think, we will evolve. We will always produce food. I left school in the 80s and went farming because the world was always going to need food and it would run out one day. It hasn't actually happened. We keep innovating and evolving, and we actually produce more food than we need. And there are a whole lot of reasons why that is. I mean, political instability would be countries running out of food. We look back through history at times when there's been great famines and food shortages. It makes the power going out not that important anymore. So I think we will continue to evolve. In 1970, which is not that long ago for many of us in here, Western Australia for the first time produced 1 million tonnes of grain. 1970. We've been up over 17 million tonnes. I think we'll get about 13 or 14 million tonnes this year. So that's how far we've come in terms of being able to produce more off the same amount of land. And I accept that a lot of the livestock have gone out of the system, so there are more crops planted, but still significant increases in productivity in farming. The countries that have the greatest levels of productivity increase in farming are those that invest the most public money into them. And look, I've sat back for my first term in government just watching the shelling out of the Department of Agriculture and Food, and it was terrible. And you lose a lot of those skills, and it takes time for us to get them back. But we've got a minister who is committed to the department, and a minister who is keen to look at change, but not make it compulsory. And I think that that finally we have someone, and as Minister for Agriculture, and who is up for the discussion and prepared to listen. And I think that's when politicians do their best work, is when they actually listen, not when they talk. So I do thank the member for bringing the motion on today. I'll take the opportunity whenever I can to talk about the great industry that is agriculture. I encourage young people to look at us as an industry. There are great opportunities. We've had the corporate versus family farming debate. We've had that in this country, and we're going down the more American corporate style of farming, which people will have a view about and will lament, because it leads to the reduction of number of people in our communities and the corporates coming in and buying these large farms that would have been once 10 or 15 family farms. But what that does is it provides opportunities for people who don't come from an agricultural background. The way I became a farmer was because my father was. But now other people, and my son is now coming back and stepping into that career as well. But I think there are opportunities now from kids from Kelmscott and the western suburbs and Midland and everywhere else in the city who love growing things and want to be involved in that industry to pick up careers with these corporate entities. And I think that will also change the dynamics of the farming workforce and management structures. So change is the only constant in life. You can be frightened of it or you can embrace its opportunities. And I think as a government and as a farmer, that's where I like to focus on. What can we do to make things better? How can we take these opportunities and build our industry even more? Because we have competition. We have competition from other countries. We have competition from our neighbour. Our neighbour is our competitor in this industry. So we all have to work smarter and better. So thanks to the Honourable Diane Evers for bringing the motion on. Do appreciate the opportunity to talk about it and get everyone involved in agriculture.
The question is the motion be agreed. I call the Honourable Diane Evers in reply.
I think our two farmers just demonstrated one of the greater challenges facing this issue. Farmers have a very long-term view of farming. Evolution is not a word that's going to help us at this point in time. Saying we've already adopted all these changes and farmers are doing it right is not going to help us at this time. We know there's a lot of problems facing the industry. We need to get to work very quickly and look at those farmers that have adopted new practices and take on board what they've been doing and put the research into trying to work out what they did that made it work so well. But by just saying, I mean, I really love the long-term view of farmers. I think it makes sense. But as my colleague Robin Chappell pointed out, even those synthetic fertilizers that we're using, we don't have endless supplies of them. We need to make some changes now to get those nutrients, get that carbon, get that stuff back into the soil so that our soil will grow our plants.